But yeah, my name's Walter. I'm a data science lead at Gauntlet. I'm going to be talking about restaking flows today. Yeah, given the many restaking platforms active on the market today, such as like your eigenlayers, your symbiotics, your Cheetos, even your Milky Ways in the modular ecosystems, it makes sense that stake can sort of move or flow between various different platforms. So I'm going to be discussing some of the, my slide's over there, oops. I'm going to be discussing some of the relationships and patterns that we've seen in some of these flows, as well as talk about what those implications might be on the services that rely on that stake. So yeah, these are the types of problems that we sort of explore at Gauntlet. We're the leading crypto economic research firm specializing in quantitative modeling and optimization at the forefront of DeFi. And we're super proud that our models have helped scale and grow dozens of protocols throughout DeFi and help secure billions of dollars in DeFi as well. In the restaking space in particular, we've worked with Eigenlayer, Puffer, Swell, EtherFi to advance the space forward. So yeah, I'll first give a brief overview of restaking today, what it looks like, what the recent developments have been. I'll then move into some of the patterns and the relationships within the flows, and then I'll finally end with sort of discussing what some of those implications are and how they might affect and how we can use these flows to mitigate risks within restaking. So yeah, introducing flows. So I'll first give a high-level overview of restaking. Basically, restaking takes that staked ETH used to secure the L1 and uses it to repurposes it to help secure secondary services on top. These secondary services can be various in nature. They can be oracles, bridges, shared sequencers, et cetera, et cetera. Operators then sort of take that stake that users delegate to them in order to perform tasks for these services. If they perform the tasks well, they get paid out a reward. If they perform these tasks not so well or they act maliciously, then they incur an economic penalty and they get slashed. The restaking platform is basically what facilitates all these interactions. And I like to call the restaking platform sort of a marketplace in that perspective. The marketplace that matches that collateral supply with the infrastructure and protocol demand for that security. The aspect that has been developing in restaking the past couple of months has been the choice of asset that can be used as collateral. In its original format, only staked ETH or its liquid formats could be used to sort of provide that collateral and crypto economic security. But the trend in the past few months has been basically for marketplaces to allow any sort of general ERC20 to be used as collateral. You can see on the right, we have a whole bunch of tokens on Symbiotic, and on the left, we have a whole bunch of tokens on Eigenlayer. These tokens are quite varied. They can be like sort of native protocol tokens, like, I don't know, like Renzo on Eigenlayer, or like FXS, EtherFi, ENA on Symbiotic. Oftentimes, users deposit these LSTs or ETH through providers that then return a liquid receipt to the user. This is what we call the liquid restaking token, or LRT, in DeFi. And these LRTs are important because it basically unlocks a lot of the lock stake that users would otherwise have to have. So based on the variability in all this, the marketplaces, the various assets, it makes sense then that stake can sort of move or flow between marketplaces or into and out of the restaking ecosystem. As an example, perhaps there's a new ERC20 type of collateral that just launched on Symbiotic, and users on restakers on Eigenlayer want to sort of rebalance out of their restaking portfolio into Symbiotic. Or in a more extreme example, suppose there is a large capital provider that's been engaged in restaking for the past couple of months, but then recently has noticed that, hey, operator performance has not been so good, there's been a lot of slashing, causes a lot of FUD, and they want to sort of withdraw their capital from the restaking ecosystem. What this implies is that this crypto economic security is not very static at all. It's very dynamic, and it's very dependent on the underlying mechanisms of the marketplaces. Now, I know that currently in the space and in the meta, everyone's saying how there's like too much crypto economic security, right? Like it's going to be hard for AVSs or services to pay out this yield. We're going to focus discussion. We're going to assume that, hey, like obviously this exists, but like we're going to assume for now that a lot of these services do require all this economic security, because while some services might require less of it, other services still do have that requirement. So with that assumption in mind, it follows then because the security is not static, that changes in this stake or flows in this stake will highly impact the security profile for these services on top. If these flows are relatively impactful, that means that if we're able to sort of quantify that marketplace flow, if we can quantify in several different dimensions, such as a time aspect, let's say like how the stake is changing over a fixed time period, let's say like an hour from now or 1 day from now, what assets are being changed, how the assets are flowing. Are they like BTC denominated, are they ETH denominated, are they native protocol token denominated? And finally, if they're going to some sort of like intermediary source first. Understanding and quantifying these flows will basically help us form a contour of the restaking dynamics. And if we can have this contour in mind, that gives us a lot of color in sort of understanding the gradients of this contour, right? If we can sort of adjust one of the variables, say like if the stake is changing, how does that actually impact the overall risk in the system? So yeah, what are some of the relationships and the flows that we've seen? Yeah, I'll first talk about a lot of the flows in Symbiotic first, which are represented by the blue line here. Yeah, I'm sorry, the numbers actually look way too small for now. But yeah, the blue line represents sort of deposits into Symbiotic, and the green line represents deposits attributed to Symbiotic LRTs. A big part of the Symbiotic LRTs is Melo. For those who are not so familiar with Melo, it's basically a protocol that facilitates permissionless curation of LRTs. And how they accomplish this is basically users can deposit their ETH into a third-party curated vault in return for that third party's liquid token back. And quickly from this, we can see like, you know, the blue line is quite spiky, right? Growth sort of explodes in the blue line around July 3rd and August 15th, which is when Symbiotic raised those deposit caps. For more context, Symbiotic basically thresholded a lot of the supply to de-risk, or like basically like capping a lot of the assets at a certain level in order to like upper bound the total risk in the system. So you can see that a lot of the Symbiotic flow is very highly defined by those caps, and you can see the explosive growth that occurs right after these caps. And on the other hand, the green line represented by Symbiotic LRTs appreciates a lot more smoothly. So this raises a pretty interesting point, right? Because the Symbiotic LRTs essentially form like an intermediary deposit source. And basically, as long as the expectation is there that Symbiotic will reopen caps down the road, that Symbiotic restaking will continue to like be a thing and continue to attract a lot of demand, these sources can continue to support demand for these types of thresholded marketplaces. So yeah, if we compare with EigenLayer, we'll notice something like a little more peculiar, a little more different, right? Here, the purple line represents flows in EigenLayer denominated in LSTs, and the red line shows flows in the EigenLayer that can be attributed to LRTs. I proxy the red line via Renzo and Ether5 deposits and withdrawals. And immediately you can sort of notice that, hey, the purple line is just going down over time, right? And essentially, like over the course of 3 months from June to like last week or something, roughly like 220K units of ETH were withdrawn via LSTs from EigenLayer, sort of monotonically decreasing over time as well. On the other hand, there's a lot of the flows from the LRTs are slightly more nuanced, right? You can see a lot of inflows in the beginning of June. It peaks at a global maximum, actually, not a local maximum, and then it starts declining. This decline, sort of this mechanism change, basically when Renzo launched or announced their withdrawal queue activation, caused a lot of outflows from EigenLayer. And you can sort of see that demand that sort of like trend downwards, and then that sort of withdrawal demand sort of taper off and reverting it back to its original sort of trend upwards. And if you combine the two together, you can sort of see like exactly what picture this paints, right? You can sort of see that, hey, overall, EigenLayer and Symbiotic flows sort of moved hand in hand together. They were both increasing for at least a couple of weeks or in early June, right? But then it was this sort of mechanism change, the fact that Renzo activated the withdrawal queue that caused this pairwise direction reversal. I don't know what the best terminology for that is. But basically, like this mechanism change disrupted the inertia behind the overall stake changes, the overall flow in the restaking ecosystems, right? And once that withdrawal demand subsided, the flows returned and back to their original like inertia and their trend upwards. If we compare the eigenlayer flows with the symbiotic flows more directly, specific with the purple and the blue lines, you can sort of see like another interesting thing, right? The purple line goes down, the blue line goes up. Naturally, that might imply that, hey, there might be some migration or flow between the marketplaces as well. There might be flows from eigenlayer into symbiotic. But then, if you look even closely, you might see that, you might wonder like, hey, not all of the stake that's leaving eigenlayer is actually going to symbiotic, right? Especially if you compare the early stages of the purple line, the decrease plus the red line, there's basically a lot more stake that's being withdrawn from eigenlayer that's going to symbiotic. So this kind of raises the question, right? Like, where is all this stake actually going? And if you do this study, you'll actually find that, hey, out of the 1 million ETH or so that's withdrawn from eigenlayer over the 3 months, basically 170K of that ETH is withdrawn by eigenlayer withdrawals, and these users have deposited 210K ETH into symbiotic, right? This 210K ETH is roughly like 40% of the 500K ETH that's in symbiotic TVL today. Simply put, that means that a huge part of the symbiotic deposits, let's just say like 40%, I think, yeah. 210 over 490 is like roughly 40%. Is it? Yeah, it's 40%. I'm still okay at math. But yeah, that just says that so much of the symbiotic TVL is directly coming from eigenlayer outflows. But if you take the inverse of that approach, you'll find that only 15 or 20%, that is 167 over 1 million, is being recycled back into the restaking ecosystem. Only 20% of the flows out of eigenlayer is coming back into a restaking marketplace or going into symbiotic. And while there may be some like lossiness in this mapping, I'm not accounting for like various different users have like a lot of wallets, I'm not accounting for all of this. This sort of recycle figure is a pretty important concept, right? If only 20% of the outflows by the leading marketplace in terms of TVL is being retained in the ecosystem, that means that like, hey, if marketplaces cannot continue to attract demand, and if services require this crypto economic security, that means that there could be sort of like a risk in this factor, right? There's actually not enough crypto economic security in the end. So yeah, what are some of the implications for the dependent services afterwards? To summarize what we've discussed before, number one, there's an inertia behind a lot of the flows towards some sort of equilibrium. Naturally, in this form, the equilibrium on the supply side is basically, hey, before all the restaking functionality goes live, we still don't know what the points look like, we still don't know what the reward looks like. Naturally, it might make sense for capital providers to continue to allocate towards restaking. The second thing is that mechanism changes can sort of disrupt that inertia, right? We saw that with the Renzo withdrawal activation and how that literally reversed the flows for eigenlayer LRTs. Moreover, these flows are fairly two-dimensional, right? They're two-dimensional, number one, in the magnitude, and number two, in the type of asset being involved. And sort of understanding this behavior lets us come up with this sort of recycling figure, right? Where 20% of the stake is being recycled from eigenlayer symbiotic and 80% is leaving, which means that it's important for services to be able to mitigate the effects of this stake churn in order to preserve their crypto economic security. So what are some solutions for these services to actually help fix this? So one way is for like services to adopt sort of like a multi-asset staking approach. This plot shows the growth of various assets in eigenlayer and symbiotic over the past couple of months. We have like SUSD, FXS, ENA, Eigen, EtherFi, WBTC. I just cherry-picked the biggest ones on here. But you can all see like sort of like a pretty clear pattern here, right? The growth sort of explodes in the very beginning, and then it sort of tapers off at the end. But essentially, like, the supply is there, right? These non-ETH assets can unlock new latent supply for economic security. And the natural question to ask is like, what is the best way for services to actually be able to use a lot of these tokens coming in, right? If the trend already exists and more assets are going to be restaked, how can a service adequately use that portfolio to best construct or like best inform their crypto economic security in the end? And there are a couple aspects to this. There's the price stability and the steady state balance. My colleague Jacob Kim actually discussed this in KBW a couple weeks ago. But basically, like, hey, price stability, is my collateral like fairly safe from a market risk perspective? And number two, a steady stake balance, is my stake resistant to flows outwards for the service itself? And what this basically means in the end is that, hey, a balanced portfolio stake to perform tasks can minimize aspects of asset-specific flow to a service, right? Specifically along the volatility/elasticity axis, and more explicitly, hey, if I'm a service, I want to balance out more elastic, but less volatile tokens against those that are more inelastic, but more volatile in that regard. And if you can construct that sort of balanced portfolio, you can sort of blend away a lot of the risks that you might otherwise incur with just a single asset. Yeah, the other approach is a marketplace staking approach. Yeah, I won't go too much into this, but essentially like, hey, if a service can sort of aggregate its stake across a variety of marketplaces instead of just isolating it to one, that also might help solve some of their crypto-economic concerns as well. Otherwise, like, this is a toy example, but it shows like, hey, if a subset of operators are sort of migrating from one marketplace to the other, there is a chance that like there is a deficit in security leading to some adversarial attacks. But yeah, I'll leave the audience with a visualization of a different kind of flow in the end. I know I talked a lot about flows in assets. Here we can sort of look into flows in AVS registrations or service registrations. Yeah, oh, the graph stopped, okay. Yeah, but basically the blue dots on the left are operators and the green dots on the right are services. And each line sort of represents the connection between the nodes, or like whether the operators register with the AVS or not. Now the big risk in all this, in this flow and stuff is basically when, hey, one flow, there's a certain reflexive aspect to these flows, right? If there is loss, if there is stake loss, whether or not that sort of spirals and whether or not you can see like sort of cascading stake loss in that regard. If we want to translate it to this graph, that basically shows like, hey, whether or not this graph suddenly becomes super, super sparse. If it becomes super, super sparse, that means the marketplace is essentially no longer performant. The final problem in all this in the end is sort of like, hey, what is the correct payment structure? What is the correct incentives that we can sort of give to operators in the stake in order to adequately compensate them for the services and yeah, for the services that they are providing in the marketplace? That remains an open question, and finding the equilibrium for that will definitely help scale restaking and actually, yeah, it will help scale restaking. Oh, I actually had 2 slides here to show the movements. But yeah, thanks guys.